Does our language shape the way we think? This old idea is known as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, or linguistic determinism. This idea is not so much that what people say has an influence on how you think. It's pretty clear from advertising and political campaigns that that's true, at least in some cases. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is more about how the structure of your language and the categories it uses to classify things shapes how you view the world. There's a strong form that language determines the way you think, and a weak form that language influences the way you think. Clearly, though, the strongest form doesn't appear to be true because we can learn new concepts or categories that don't occur in our native language, like schadenfreude, which is like glee over another person's misery. When George Bush was in office, it was falsely claimed that he said, "The French have no word for entrepreneur," suggesting something like the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Since the French don't have the word, it's not emphasized in French culture, and maybe they can't even grasp what it is. Of course, the joke was that entrepreneur is actually a French word. The weak form of the hypothesis has been debated over the decades, falling in and out of favor, and it's experiencing a kind of revival in recent years. In the more recent form of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the idea is that humans have to carve up the world into categories that are important to us, because our senses are such that we aren't able to attend to everything that's in our surroundings. How we chunk up the world says a lot about who we are as a society, and as such, language represents a different way of seeing the world. And if language shapes how we see the world, then languages represent different ways of perceiving and knowing the world. We can see from looking at different languages that each has to pay attention to different things when just speaking on a daily basis. For example, some languages have to pay attention to the gender of the speaker. They have to pay attention to when things happened, or how a person came about the information, whether it's directly or indirectly. And so, speakers of different languages have to pay attention to different things. Grammatical gender assigns a gender to nouns, as in la luna. In languages that have grammatical gender, kids unwittingly provide feminine voices for feminine nouns when asked to impersonate them. Adults who use languages with grammatical gender tend to use stereotypically masculine or feminine attributes when describing masculine or feminine nouns. And of course, when concepts are personified, like Lady Liberty, liberté, they take on the gender of the noun. Written language also influences how we perceive time flowing. When asked to arrange a sequential series of pictures like a man aging or an apple being eaten, Americans tend to do it from left to right, since that is how we read. Try this with someone you know. However, there can be some serious miscommunication, as in advertising, when the concepts of how time flows don't translate. So in this case, Arabic speakers were seeing their child being affected negatively by this product. We can see this embedded concept of time in tests that require speakers to select a spatial arrangement that runs counter to the one they're used to. So in these tests, Americans had a really hard time with choosing earlier in this position and later in this position, or earlier in this position and later in this position. In some languages, there are no words for numbers higher than 3 or 5. So anything higher than these numbers is just referred to as many. Even though there are hundreds of medicinal and edible plants that these people can keep track of, they have difficulty keeping track of large groups of things. And some argue that it's the absence of a linguistic category for these numbers that makes this task difficult. In other cases, it's been argued that numbering systems that are internally consistent, like 10-1 for 11, make grasping mathematical concepts easier. 11 through 19, for example, in English is difficult for children to wrap their heads around because it simply doesn't follow an obvious pattern. Languages also divide up the color spectrum in different ways. We have primary and secondary colors, for example, And Russian has more than one distinct color term for blue, whereas English has dark blue and light blue. But it's not exactly clear where the cutoff is. Russians, it turns out, were faster at identifying these two colors than Americans, presumably because they have linguistic categories for these colors.